Tom Slater. So hello, both of you.
Hi.
So let's take a look then at the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers. And following Lord Hain's speech in the House of Lords, naming Sir Philip Green as the man who tried to stop the Daily Telegraph from reporting allegations of sexual harassment and racist behaviour, the paper leads with that very story. Sir Philip strongly denies any such conduct. The Financial Times calls him the highest profile Briton embroiled in the global backlash against sexual harassment. The Metro reports that Lord Hain felt he had a public duty to reveal Sir Philip Green's identity using parliamentary privilege. The Guardian's headline focuses on Sir Philip Green's denial of the allegations. The Express says the Topshop owner was named and shamed, as does the Daily Mail. MPs are calling for Sir Philip Green to be stripped of his knighthood, according to the Times. The business tycoon is also on the front of the I newspaper, who say he was unmasked. And the Sun pictures Sir Philip Green with Harvey Weinstein. While the Mirror's headline simply reads, "The fall and fall of Sir Philip Green." And a change of pace in the Star, which leads with a story about a university student vowing to tear down a World War I memorial because it only featured white men. So let's talk through those front pages as well as stories inside as well with Sonia Sodha and Tom Slater. And all but one of those front pages have Sir Philip Green on their front. And to put it into context, while we look at the Telegraph and its coverage, 2 days ago, this newspaper, of course, published a story saying it had been prevented from publishing allegations against a businessman by an injunction. Today, we've seen Lord Hain standing up in the House of Lords, using parliamentary privilege to name Sir Philip Green, saying that he was the man at the centre of the allegations. And before we get cracking on this, we should say that there has been a statement from Sir Philip Green saying that he's not commenting on anything that's happened in court or was said in Parliament today. And he said that the extent to which it's suggested that I've been guilty of unlawful sexual or racist behaviour, I categorically and wholly deny these allegations. So that's just to set things out before we get started. So there's the Daily Telegraph's take on it. They are now reporting the story from the point of view of what Lord Hain said in the House of Lords today.
So this is sort of the kind of bizarre nature of the situation, really, which is that the press can report what Lord Hain said in the House of Lords, but they are not allowed to sort of go into lots of detail about the allegations.
Because there's still the injunction in place.
Exactly. There's still an injunction from the Court of Appeal which says that the press are not able to report on these. And what Lord Hain did in the House of Lords was he used a 17th century law, so it's a very long-standing law around parliamentary privilege, and really what that is designed to do is to allow MPs and peers to speak their mind in Parliament without fear of being sued for libel. So it's really to enable the freest debate possible. But parliamentary privilege has been used in the past to name the subjects of injunctions. And so there's obviously a lot of focus on Sir Philip Green, but there's a lot of restrictions about what can be said. But there's also, in parallel, a debate going on about non-disclosure agreements, and which is why an injunction was granted, because NDAs, as they're often called, have been used in this case. And we also know, looking at other very powerful men, for example, Harvey Weinstein, he used non-disclosure agreements, a lot of people say, to essentially silence some pretty powerless victims and prevent things from coming out that are in the public interest, that the public should know.
OK, so two things to kind of focus on there. And we should say that I think the Telegraph, under the terms of the injunction, can't confirm or deny whether or not Lord Hain has named the person that they were talking about in their original story. So parliamentary privilege, first of all, there'll be judges and lawyers who'll say that they've weighed up issues in a case, and then someone can stand up in the Houses of Parliament and name someone that they have blocked. Is that an odd situation to be in this day and age?
I think it is an odd situation to be in this day and age, but I wouldn't put the onus on the question of the judges making these rulings, but it's actually on the question of the public's and the press ability to discuss these things and report on them openly. I think Lord Hain's comments in Parliament today just remind us that there are so many things like this which limit free discussion of important issues, free discussion of important stories. And I really don't think it should fall to a Lord or a Member of Parliament to stand up and, you know, by dint of their special privileges, be able to talk about things that otherwise we should all be discussing. And I think that's one of the things to come out about this, which is the role that injunctions play in really limiting press freedom in terms of these discussions. So much so that so much of our discussion tonight is about those restrictions rather than the story itself.
Well, that's right. We're very limited in what we can say. So let's move on to the Guardian's front page while we talk about those non-disclosure agreements. So there's their headline, Philip Green, I'm not guilty of unlawful sexual racist behaviour. So you talked about non-disclosure agreements. Even Theresa May yesterday touched on the subject in the House of Commons, not talking specifically about this case because she can't talk specifically about this case, but did raise some questions about them, saying that it was important that they weren't used ever to silence whistleblowers. I mean, to what extent is there concern, do you think, about the way that sometimes these agreements are used?
I think there's a lot of concern about it. I mean, you see that in the fact that the Prime Minister brought it up in the House of Commons, but it's not even just the Prime Minister, it's MPs on both sides of the House. So Jess Phillips, a Labour MP, has spoken out about this. Maria Miller, who's the chair of the Women and Equalities Select Committee. And I think the concern about them stems from this fact that there is, you know, they were originally sort of designed as legal agreements to stop people taking trade secrets with them when they left a particular company to go and work for a competitor. But what's really emerged is that they are being used by very rich, wealthy, powerful people, often men, to prevent people who allege abuse or harassment against them from ever speaking out in public about it. And I think the concern is that if you're able to afford these very, very specialist, highly paid lawyers, it's not an even balance of power, is it? If and somebody who has been subject to harassment or abuse or bullying in the workplace for a very long period of time may feel they've got no choice other than to sign an agreement. So I think that is where the concern comes from, and I think there certainly will be big picture questions about these agreements asked going forwards, which is not to say that they are never a legitimate device, but that actually if very powerful people are using them to silence people that they've oppressed, that is really quite concerning. Well, yes,
and many people, many employers might say, well, these people that we're asking to sign them are adults. It's up to them whether or not they do sign them. But originally they were used, weren't they, to kind of protect commercial secrets perhaps when someone was leaving to go to another company, for example.
Exactly, and I think on that point, which is why no one's rushing to say that these should be banned outright, no one's suggesting that the whole idea of it would never have any place. But I think what the concern is that these NDAs are being used increasingly for these specific types of cases. And as you say, there might be a case that, you know, between consenting adults, these things should be agreed. But again, back in March, actually, the Solicitors Regulatory Authority raised the alarm about this because they were seeing increasingly NDAs being used to cover up not just, again, things that people might not want to get out, but actually to the point in which people were scared about going to the authorities with allegations that were criminal in nature. And I think when you get into a situation in which, by dint of how much money you've got, you can effectively bypass the legal system in that sense, that's not just for anyone.
I think that's right, and it can cost hundreds of thousands of pounds to afford these things, so there's something that's available to the very rich and wealthy and no one else.
OK, well, let's move on, but as we say, the paper's all going with the fact that Lord Hain has mentioned this name, and some of them going with Philip Green's denials there, like the Guardian, for example. But let's move on to other stories. On the front of the Telegraph, a story that may have had more prominence on another day, and this is the continuing investigation into the mail bomb scare, is how the Telegraph puts it, and Donald Trump's response to it in America.
No, definitely. So this is the story that's been unfolding to a lot of horror, I think, in the US. It's really the leading story everywhere in America right now, as much as you can tell. There have been this series of mail bombs, pipe bombs, suspicious powders being sent to various people who, frankly, are all vocal critics of Donald Trump. So it ranges from Robert De Niro, who was mentioned here, former Vice President Joe Biden, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, former CIA Director John Brennan. It was sent to CNN mistakenly because he's actually a contributor at MSNBC, but that was messed up, it seems. And it's really tapped into this discussion, particularly because Trump responded to it first trying to strike quite a presidential conciliatory tone, trying to bring everyone together, but then not being able to resist an opportunity to have a pop at the media for potentially stirring this up. It has created this whole discussion about how much the heightened rhetoric in America has potentially created the situation in which more of these things might happen. That, I think, is a dangerous road to go down insofar as you end up stripping the people responsible of responsibility for those things, but that's definitely definitely how the debate is.
And of course, it's early in investigations, and we don't know who's behind it or what their motives are. But it has prompted a discussion, hasn't it, about the level of debate?
Absolutely. And I mean, gosh, we're talking about responsibility here. I mean, Trump seems to be saying, well, you know, these media organisations, some of which have been targeted, are responsible, which is an absolutely shocking thing, I think, for a president to be saying in these circumstances. And I think there are very, very serious questions to be asked. We've seen a hugely heightened debate. Some people would say on both sides, but I would say particularly if you focus on President Trump and his followers. You know, President Trump has been a long-time attacker of the press, calling journalists enemies of the people, saying good things about Republican politicians that have physically attacked, like, you know, Guardian journalists in the US. His rhetoric is very, very hyped up. And I think politicians as well have to take some responsibility, because we know that context matters. You know, these are acts of domestic terrorism. Of course, the people who perpetrate them have to be held responsible, or likely domestic terrorism. We don't know exactly what's behind it yet. But the heightened, polarised debate absolutely does not help. It's completely irresponsible, and it's got to stop. We can't have the most powerful man in the world basically saying that journalists are enemies of the people.
Do you think that's right, and the finger should be pointed at Donald Trump, or would you say that there's heightened talk on both sides that should be toned down?
I think it's fair to say that there is heightened talk on both sides. I mean, if you think about the way in which Donald Trump and his ascendancy has been talked about, I mean, he's been casually compared to kind of fascistic dictators constantly puffed up as a kind of threat to all that is moral and decent. It's not saying I'm in favour of Donald Trump.
I think for very good reason when you look at some of his
But nevertheless, you could easily make an argument on the other side, which I wouldn't support, which is to say that that has also contributed to a climate. For instance, Steve Scalise, Republican congressman, was shot by a Bernie Sanders supporter last year. Now, in that case, I don't think it's appropriate at all to suggest that, again, progressive liberal rhetoric in the US is responsible. Similarly, I don't think we should do that in this case.
OK, we must go to a break. Sorry to cut in, but lots more to talk about after the break, though, because coming up, the climber who calls himself Spider-Man has been at it again. We'll tell you more about that when we come back.